Maroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I thank the Minister for her contribution, but I'm afraid it didn't actually address the issues that my colleague Jacinda Ardern had asked with regard to her concerns around this part of the bill, and in particular with the concerns about the United Nations Right of the Child Conventions, which I think, in my reading of this part 2 of this bill, actually does cause New Zealand some grief in terms of its commitments in that regard. And Mr Chair, I have had the opportunity to contribute to this debate in the earlier parts of the committee stages, and in the main was very focused on whether the boot camp model was the right pathway to go down for our young people who are in trouble with the justice system and in trouble with the course of their lives, and in particular thinking about the very good model that has been established in Hamilton and that this government is closing down with te hurihanga, as that seems a much better way to be dealing with these issues. And when it comes to part 2 of this bill, Mr Chair, what I would be interested in understanding from the Minister is, in particular, what the implications are for Clause 42, which amends the Criminal Justice Act, and of course amends it in a way that has children been subject to our youth justice facilities. And I'm particularly keen to know what that means in terms of residential facilities when it comes to 12 and 13-year-olds. And I've got to say I am interested from a personal perspective as well, Mr Chair, because when I read this as a Member of Parliament, I also can't help but read this as a mother as well, because I can't separate the two sometimes, and I think that's probably a good thing. That's why we have women in this House, actually, because it's important that we actually wear those hats, all of those hats, when we're reading legislation. And I am the mother of a 12-year-old, and I'm reading this part of the Act and wondering about the rights of my 12-year-old with regard to having compulsory bodily samples taken. It's not something that I relish the idea of as a parent, I can tell you, Mr Chair. And what are the... Mr Burrows seems to think that he's got the answer to the anxiety that parents might have about the rights of children, about the rights of children at the ages of 12 and 13. But certainly my belief is that children, and I am interested that at least part 2 does call these 12 and 13-year-olds children, because they are, and there are other parts of this bill that pretends otherwise, but we are talking about children, 12 and 13 years old. If my son was in this position, for example, and if he was being accused of a crime, would I be with him? Would there be a requirement for the parents to be informed? Would the parents need to give consent for bodily samples to be taken from a 12-year-old? Because those are the things that I think that New Zealand parents will be contemplating as they're hearing this debate, because I think they are very important issues to be considering. Because certainly I don't believe that being the mother of a current 12-year-old, that he would be in a position to make legal decisions about his rights in this regard. And I think that those are the sorts of things that I'd like to hear more succinctly from the Minister. I think the Minister stood up and read out perfectly well what we can all see in front of us, because we can all see which parts of which bills have been amended. But what we're really interested in is what this means with regard to our international obligations. We want to know what discussions have been had with other ministers with regard to this, and we want to know exactly what this means in terms of children and the way they're treated. Mr Chair, I started out talking about residential facilities, and I guess that's where I want to end my contribution, because the Te Hurihanga facility, for example, in Hamilton, is an 8-bedded facility, and I want to know whether 12-year-olds will be in a residential facility staying overnight with 24-year-olds.